Okay, y'all, I think it's time to get started. Thank you so very much for being with us and welcome to the NEA CARES Act webinar. I'm Lila Tamari, I'm the Senior Program Officer at Art Place America, and it's a real pleasure for us to host this conversation for our friends at the NEA who are moving mountains for all of us. I'll introduce Jen and Cliff momentarily. They'll be guiding us through the content, but first I just want to do some grounding and some housekeeping for everybody. I know it goes without saying that this is a really unprecedented and difficult time for millions of people. So I just merely wanted to acknowledge and thank each of you for being incredible leaders, for being so resilient and moving at this time. Thank you for all you're doing to move things forward and what you'll continue to do in helping this country heal and rebuild. As for housekeeping, thank you for giving me a reason to use my podcast voice, wear makeup, wear a nice dress. Unfortunately, we cannot see your beautiful faces or hear your best radio voices, but you can still ask us questions. We should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, and this is the important part, so listen carefully. If you have a question or issue with technology, for instance, audio cutting in and out, please click the chat button on the bottom of your screen and send your note to Art Place America. We'll do our best to help you resolve your issue. If you have a question about content, that is eligibility, application materials, review process, etc., please click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring questions there and either responding directly to you or answer the question live so everyone can know the answer. And if you miss some important information, don't stress out. The webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with all the registrants and beyond, so it will be archived. Without further ado, let's get to the fun stuff. It's with immense gratitude that I want to introduce Jen Hughes, Director of Design and Creative Placemaking at the NEA, and Cliff Murphy, Director of Folk and Traditional Arts at the NEA. And they and the entire team at the NEA have been moving very quickly to make sure resources are deployed all over the country. So thank you both so much for all you do. And without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Cliff to get us started. Thank you.
Hey there, everybody. Well, thanks for making the time to be on this webinar today. It's you know, I wish that we were all able to be together in the same place. Of course, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation if we could be. And so just to echo something that our friends at Art Place mentioned, you know, we are here in service to you, and we are just amazed on a daily basis by the work that you do in service to the communities and artists that you serve. So, you know, as you may have, or as I'm sure that you have read, the recently passed CARES Act Congress allocated $75 million to the National Endowment for the Arts to distribute in funding to support arts organizations that are negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to give you a really basic, you know, Jen is going to walk us through a pretty basic breakdown of that information. But I think that the real thing to focus on is that these are operating funds, right? So the intention of this particular pool of funds is primarily to retain jobs and to keep the doors of arts organizations open. And so This involves a little bit of a culture shift temporarily in our grant making. You know, we are an organization whose grant making typically is tied specifically to projects and not to operating funds. And so um, for many of our grantees and for us as a staff, much of our time in terms of grant making is spent, really honing in on projects. And so all of us collectively, I think, are going to have to take a step back from that for this particular opportunity with the CARES Act, and to really focus tightly on operating funds, right? So to think in terms of funding that can save jobs, funding that can cover the cost of you know uh, fees for contracts and artists, as well as fees for utilities and rent and these sorts of things. So again, the intention here is to keep jobs and to keep doors open, or to keep arts organizations up and running as we weather this pandemic. So Jen will walk us through the kind of give an overview of the specifics of this, and then we can get into some Q&A. But that is in terms of framing a successful request for funding for this is, as you might imagine, going to be a very competitive process, and need is going to be acute, I think, for nearly everybody who's applying. And I think that, the more that your applications can focus on, the goals of this pot of funds, and where you can be really kind of sprinkling in there information about who you are serving, who your institution serves, who your program serves, that is going to just help to clarify for readers and panelists the really specific need that your organization has. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jen, and thanks again for spending this time with us. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Cliff. And just wanted to say ditto to all that was shared by Lila and Cliff. It's a real honor to be with all of you virtually, and I've been thinking a lot about all of you out there in the field, and I'm still incredibly inspired by the passion that we see emanating in this really challenging time. So I'm going to just kind of do a quick run through just to familiarize you all with some of the details about the CARES Act funding opportunity. We're going to focus, as Cliff alluded, to the 60% of the NEA funding that was given to distribute in direct grants. And I think it's really important to also simultaneously keep in mind you should be tracking what's happening in your state arts agency and your regional arts organizations as well. And there will be a couple cases where local arts agencies will be eligible to subgrant out funding. The good news is that by the end of this month, the states will actually have that $30 million in hand all across the country, and be beginning to sort of make their plans for how they are going to distribute that NEA funding throughout their program. So make sure you keep tabs on that as well. So specifically, the eligibility for the NEA CARES Act grant funding is critical for you to really focus on. You must be a previous NEA award recipient from the past 4 years. Those are fiscal year 2017 to 2020 awardees. We know that's disappointing to many folks out there, but it was sort of a decision made on both managing the bandwidth of our agency and what we're able to handle in review of applications, as well as these are awardees that have, and organizations that have been vetted through our processes before, so we can really expedite the awarding of funding, which is a primary focus for this program. We're basically doing the work of this grants review process 3 times faster than we typically do in some of our other grant programs. So we're really committed to getting that money out the door by July 1st. It's also important that you are still maintaining and meeting the legal requirements, including nonprofit status at the time of application, or that you're still a unit of government or federally recognized tribal government. And you want to just keep an eye on submitting your final report packages by the due dates for previous awards. Some good news, we have extended out just automatically the final report deadline, I believe by 3 months blanket across the agency, but just make sure you stay up to date on those. And if you need any additional assistance in extending those out further, you can certainly reach out to the grant specialist at the NEA. And lastly, it's one application per organization. So here's the short of it. This is a very different application, as Cliff alluded to, that we are looking to support operational costs. So this is very clear. These are the only costs that we're supporting with this $50,000 grant. Applicants all must apply for that level. It's just a single $50,000 grant for either salary support, full or partial for one or more positions critical to an organization's artistic mission, fees for artists and or contractual personnel to maintain the work and expand during the period in which such persons would be already engaged, and facilities costs such as rent and utilities. So really keep that in mind, keep that front and center. The intention of this application process is to get money out the door as quickly as possible to support the operations of arts and cultural organizations throughout the country. And the application is really structured to be quite simple. I think the thing that we're really excited about is there is a no cost share match requirement. Being an NEA grantee in the past, you know that we require that one-to-one match for NEA grant funding. This does not have that requirement tied to it. So that's important to keep in mind. And I think it's also worthwhile to mention, you can sort of have a period of support for that $50,000 grant up to 2 years. So if you're a smaller organization and you're sort of thinking through, how do I actually access at that $50,000 level? You could request support for up to a 2-year period. So really quickly, the application timeline, as you all know, it's coming up quite fast. And as you all are likely familiar with, being past NEA grantees, you must submit that SF424 through grants.gov. Do not miss this deadline, April 22nd. You could go in and do it now. Just make sure that you get that first step of the application in. And then part 2 is really to submit through our applicant portal. It will become available and open April 27th and close on May 4th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, we anticipate a huge volume of applications, so do not miss these deadlines. Just get started on that right away if you are able to. And have your application materials ready for submission to the applicant portal well in advance. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. We will be doing a very quick turnaround, hosting grant panels, and notifying folks in June as to whether or not they are awarded grant funding. And the earliest beginning start date is July 1st, 2020. So that's a quick overview of the timeline that we'll revisit again towards the end. So this is just a little screenshot from our website. Log on to arts.gov and you can review in detail the CARES Act guidelines. And the first thing you want to click on is that Part 1 submission. Submit it through grants.gov with all the basic organizational information that you typically include in an application to the NEA. And then really Part 2, as always, is the meat of the application. If you miss that first deadline in Part 1, unfortunately, you're not able to submit Part 2. So just don't miss that deadline and get that in as soon as you're able to. So I didn't go through kind of typing out all the details of the Part 2 materials, but I think it's worthwhile to note that the application is extremely simple and is intended to be very, very straightforward. So in that Part 2 link that I have up on the screen there, you can download the PDF, which walks you through all of the questions. And I'm just going to illustrate just how simple it is. For example, we often ask you in submitting an application to come up with a creative project title. And in this case, you are literally going to just type in jobs and/or facility support. This is a reminder that we're looking for operational expenses, and that is how you should be looking to complete your application. So it's really quite straightforward. The project description, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. As Cliff mentioned, we're funding operational support, potentially up to a 2-year period with that $50,000 grant. And it's very clear about what we're asking for in that section. We're asking for the job positions for which you're seeking support, a description of the artists and or contractual personnel whom you propose to pay fees, and in 2 or 3 brief sentences, broadly describe any facilities costs that are required. Again, keep in mind that our readers are going to be reviewing lots of applications, so getting really to the point, being succinct about the need is critical and key. And beyond that, we ask you to include the project budget, what's sort of that breakdown for that $50,000 amount. And we also have some sample examples of how to think about that in there. And those project expenses should only be salaries, wages, fringe benefits, fees for artists and contractual personnel, and facilities costs, such as rent and utilities. It's also worthwhile to note that if you're taking a look at our guidelines online for local arts agencies that have been awarded subgranting ability in the past 4 years are eligible to apply to the local arts agencies opportunity. But for the vast majority of folks out there, you're really looking at these direct $50,000 grants. So that's what we're gonna focus on today, unless we get any further questions of clarification. So how are we going to be reviewing applications? So as you know, our mandated review criteria legislatively is artistic excellence and artistic merit, and that is really reflected in how we will guide our review panels that will be assessing the applications. So make sure you reference these. So we're looking for the potential to have a significant and immediate impact on the arts workforce, demonstrated significance to the mission and core work of the organization, the ability to carry out the award, including the appropriateness of the budget, the resources involved, and the personnel, and as appropriate, the extent to which the organization serves underserved populations, such as those opportunities to experience the arts that are limited by geography, ethnicity, economics, or disability. So just to give you a little bit of a ballpark understanding to how to think about your application, if all of the eligible applicants apply to the agency, I think we're somewhere in the ballpark of 3,000 to 3,500 grantees. Kind of doing the rough math at that $50,000 level, we'll be able to fund roughly 20 to 25% of projects that come in the door. So we know that's a really competitive consideration for you all to think about. And you might be wanting to just think about ways to elevate the story about your organization and those operational needs during this time in response to the moment that we find ourselves in and the challenges that you're facing. So that's just a little tip on perhaps how to think about that. I think folks will be really happy to know, even with this condensed time frame, our application review process is happening through our typical panel process. We are doing readers by discipline, then there will be a large cross-discipline panel to ultimately select the awardees. So again, you will be having your application reviewed, hopefully by peers in your field that are familiar with your organization, but once it moves on to that cross-discipline panel, you want to make sure that you are really conveying the importance and relevance of your organizational's work so that somebody that's not in your discipline can really understand and comprehend the critical need of support. So I think that's really important to emphasize, because in a typical grant panel, you're always being reviewed by your peers, folks that may have heard of your organization, you know, maybe operating in the theater world, for example, if you're applying as a theater. And that will be the case for the first round review, but then ultimately funding will be adjudicated via a cross-discipline panel. So just make sure you're really making that strong case in your application in terms of the mission critical work that your organization is providing that otherwise wouldn't be able to provide in light of this this moment of pandemic. Oh, and just on that slide, as you all know quite well, the NEA is really seeking to impact a broad constituency. So just like the diversity of our NEA grantees, will be adjudicating funding across a wide geographic range and organizations that also seek to serve underserved populations. So lastly, just a reminder, we are looking for very, very quick turnaround time. We know that this deadline is fast approaching. We really hope and anticipate that the application as it's laid out is really quite simple and can be completed in a very short amount of time, since it is operational costs. No need for really creative project titles or any project ideas at all. This is solely operational expenses. And we want to get the award and money out the door as quickly as possible and into your hands, which is why the earliest beginning date is July 1st. So even if you are eligible and you're taking advantage of the CARES opportunity, keep in mind we are moving forward with other grant deadlines in our agency. We're also simultaneously going to be reviewing those applications that came in our February deadline. We have another Grants for Arts Projects deadline of July 9th, 2020. So those guidelines are up on our website. Keep an eye on those. You can apply to both CARES and the Grants for Arts Project going forward, because the Grants for Arts Project are really looking further out in the future to fund and support work after July 1st of 2021. And also the Our Town grant application, we anticipate an August 2020 deadline, and those guidelines should be released shortly in mid-May. So I ran through a lot of information really quickly, wanted to purposely hopefully keep it a little high level because I think that the step 2 application itself is pretty straightforward, and we wanted to be sure that we can hit on questions, thoughts, concerns that the audience has to share. And Cliff, before we do that, maybe just turn it back over to you if you have anything that you wanted to emphasize or lift up in that presentation.
So I'll apologize, Jen. I've been trying to answer as many of the Q&A questions as they've been rolling in as I can. You know, I would actually encourage people to kind of look at that. I see we have 65 open questions and 17 answered. So I feel like it's been nonstop, but obviously I've been running behind. So there are a bunch of questions that people have asked that are very similar. And so I'm going to try to just respond to some of those really simply, if I can. So there are a number of folks that have written in with a question about whether or not this is something that is open to new applicants, so people who haven't received funding from the Arts Endowment before directly. And the answer to that is no. But organizations that have not received funding from the National Endowment for the Arts are eligible to seek funding from their state arts agencies and from their regional arts organizations. And so we encourage you to do that. So remember, of the $75 million that we received, $30 million goes automatically to state arts agencies and regional arts organizations to distribute at the local level. And so the rules that our agency has set for our direct grant it's a different set of eligibility requirements at the state and regional level. We've also gotten a lot of questions from people who have received some amount of Arts Endowment dollars in their grants that they have received from their state arts agency or their local arts agency in the past. The same is true for those applicants. They are not eligible for direct grants from the Arts Endowment for this CARES funding. Only those organizations who have received a grant from us between fiscal year 17 and fiscal year 20, including those organizations that would have just found out in the last couple of days that they received funding, those organizations are eligible. Yes, Jen.
And or may find out this week, because I think it's a rolling
Yes.
notification that's happening currently.
Yes. So another common question that has come through is that a lot of people are wondering if they can be receiving funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and from their state arts agency and from their local arts agency or their regional arts organization or from the Small Business Administration. The answer to that is the Arts Endowment's policy is yes. Though your organization, let's say you shoot the moon on this and you receive funding from multiple sources of CARES support, you will want to make sure that those requests are for different budget lines, right? So that you're not asking 4 different sources for funding support for the same salary line, for instance, because when it comes time on that, that will cause that will be a significant problem in terms of reporting, and so that is something that we consider non-allowable.
And just to piggyback on that, Cliff, I think that the one thing to take in consideration where organizations are tapping different streams of federal funding is the timing of things. So I know some of the SBA funding, might be a stopgap in June, but keep in mind, as long as you're sort of parsing out the period of support you're asking the NEA for funding, vis-a-vis some of those other opportunities, you are sort of segmenting the support. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I know that is a question on a lot of folks' minds. But in the way that we ask you to be really cognizant about your period of support, so you're not double dipping from multiple NEA grants or multiple federal sources, use sort of that same thought process in applying for funding in that way.
Thank you, Jen and Cliff. And I echo, there are almost 100 questions now in the Q&A. So what I think we can do is I can help by going through and kind of just reiterating some of them. And what I'll ask is that I know folks want to make sure their questions get answered. We're going to go at least until we either answer the questions or until the hour is up. So be patient with us. We may repeat questions, but hold off for now maybe on typing new ones unless you've scrolled through all of them and see that it's not yet there. So thanks for your patience. And why don't I just go through and share a few more questions for you all, and then you can tag team. Sound good?
That sounds
Great.
good. And can I just, one thing I had just clicked on that I'd answer a couple of questions live. They're really simple, so I just don't want to lose track of that. You don't need to submit work samples for this particular application. Indirects are allowable, and if your staff is paid as contractual personnel, that is also eligible.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I know there were, you all answered a couple questions about other agencies. So I'm gonna mark some of those answered, and we'll move on. You may have already or talked about this, so apologies, but we have a question around the CARES Act being designed for, is it for a specific project or salary or combination of both? Can you just reiterate your answer to that?
Go ahead, Cliff.
No, I was waiting for you, Jen.
So it's not a specific project. You're really looking for operational costs and expenses. So, for example, all of our other funding at the agency is really project specific, where we ask you to articulate and talk about that project, ask you to really identify the project personnel that are going to be working on that project by their percentage of time. This is really operational support. So you don't need to get creative in concocting a project. That actually is not the intention of the program. The intention of the program is to retain existing jobs, whether they're filled or currently unfilled, but it's really to retain existing jobs and keep the doors open for organizations to be able to ultimately weather this really difficult moment.
Great. So that would include, for instance, admin staff, education staff, or if someone's running an art residency, non-residency focused staff as well.
Sure. Yep, that certainly could include those folks. I would say you might want to be a little bit more strategic in narrowing like 1 or 2 critical personnel, or thinking about, that $50,000 grant amount. So you're really able to make a strong case and tell the story of why this grant need is so critical.
Perfect. I'm going to jump around. We're not going to be able to do all like questions. So let's answer a question now just about technology. If someone has a question about the credentials or the portal, who do they contact?
So for the first step, we have a lot of great contact information on our website for grants.gov. That is a system that is not operated by NEA, but is the first step of our process. You'll also see up on your screen right now, I included a direct link to the appropriate discipline staff at the agency. That is their direct email contact information and phone numbers. I would encourage folks to always email, just because we're now all working remotely, and that is the most expedited and easiest way to connect with staff. So you can they will be able to help and assess questions related to the Part 2 step. But if you're trying to get your grants.gov credentials, your SAM credentials, that has to be done through the grants.gov or SAM help desk. But we have information on where to contact, the contact information for that on our website. So just go to arts.gov.
Perfect. More questions about eligibility. I'll just give you 2. They're not related, but 2 questions. Are you eligible to apply if you have not submitted a final report for another NEA grant? And are you eligible for this program if you are awarded a grant that will be announced later this month? For instance, you've applied already and you're waiting to hear, will you be eligible?
Yes, you are eligible. I think the key thing to remember is that sort of that double dipping kind of applies. So if you have a staff position that's percentage allocated to execute a particular project, then you don't want to include that percentage or perhaps that staff position in the application for the CARES Act. But you certainly can apply for CARES Act funding, even if you have a project that's currently open. Again, just make sure you're not double dipping and requesting funding for something that's already being funded or supported in an open project, or perhaps even a project that was recently awarded.
Great. Let's just talk about what will happen after applying. Do you all have a sense of what percentage of eligible applicants will receive an award?
We don't, because it's really a wait and see to see how many applications come in the door. We really don't know how many people are going to apply for support. What we do know is that the case for so many organizations are in acute need right now, and I think that the applications are going to be reflective of that acute need. And so I think it's going to be really important that organizations are as clear as possible about what it is that they're requesting, why they're requesting it, and what its relationship is to to the objectives of the funding. And also to give a sense of the constituency that you're reaching. these grants are going to need to cover a broad range of the United States, really by every measure, from geography to discipline to communities served, etc. And so, I think that the tenor of these applications is all going to be pretty similar, and so just be sure that you are coming right at this, that you're sticking to these eligibility requirements, and that you're answering the questions directly. This is not unfortunately, this is not an opportunity to kind of develop a creative new project within the frame of, I would not encourage organizations to try to look at this as a new opportunity, because I don't think that those applications are going to be terribly competitive. I think that the objective here is to retain jobs and to keep organizations running.
Thank you.
And yeah.
I related to that, there are some questions that are coming up about whether bigger or smaller orgs may be prioritized based on need, or what need means in general, which you've answered to some extent, but just folks are also wanting to understand, is community impact related to need in terms of who's being served? If you could just share more about that, you or Jen.
I mean, yes, community impact is important. And community impact is not something that's measured in the size of an organization. This is a process in which small organizations and large organizations and everybody in between are understood within their own context. And so, as director of folk and traditional arts, many, if not most of the organizations that we fund are small to mid-size. The organizations we think of as large organizations within my discipline would be considered small in most other disciplines. And the Arts Endowment sees those organizations as important to the core of its mission. And so, I feel like I have many conversations in folk and traditional arts where small organizations are considering taking themselves out of the running because they are assuming that their size means that they won't be competitive. And I would do my best to discourage that approach. I think that small does not mean non-competitive.
Great. I'm gonna keep scrolling down, but quickly there are some other questions about eligibility for large universities. So we understand it's one application per organization, but if a large university has many entities considered an independent component, would those independent components each be eligible to apply, or is it still just that one university? And then I guess just related, since it's another question about universities, can salary support go to faculty at a staff or college or facility costs?
So I think on that question about sort of how many eligible applications, if the independent components are also direct grantees of the NEA, then they can apply as that independent component. And if the university has also been awarded funding through a direct grant, they could also apply. I think that second question about staff salaries at a university is more a question of competitiveness in this portfolio, knowing that we will be able to fund roughly 800 applications. And as Cliff really highlighted, there is such an acute need where there are organizations who, sort of thrive on the in-person arts and cultural experience, festivals, or theater performances or other really critical community artistic gatherings. And so just trying to think through how to position an application that's really competitive from a university. Is that a job that is at risk in the absence of support for CARES Act funding? Is just the way that I think you really need to think about articulating the need there for support of retaining that job.
Thank you so much. So just another question about technology. Could you clarify when the grant portal will open versus when you have to get your credentials by? Does that make sense?
Sure. I'm just going to go right back to our application timeline. So you have to submit step 1 by April 22nd, 2020. And then the applicant portal will open to begin upload or copy pasting information in there April 27th. It closes on May 4th. We already have all of the questions that will be in the applicant portal and all the details of what you need to prepare up on our website. So you can get started on actually compiling that information now and do sort of a quick copy paste once the applicant portal opens. That would be my guidance.
Okay. And then lots of questions about what will happen when, what does it look like for payment to be dispersed? Is it going to be a reimbursement in advance? Yeah, I think that's a summary of what those questions are.
So it's adhering to our typical way that we distribute funding at the agency. You can request an advancement of funding that's going to be expended within the next 30 days, or you can request a reimbursement for, again, those operational costs after July 1st, 2020, up to a project period of 2 years, but it can certainly be shorter.
Okie dokie.
So I think that's an important thing to note, our reporting requirements, other elements of managing an NEA grant have to be kept up. Sort of the way in which we require our grantees to keep really detailed records around expenses and costs incurred, et cetera. So all of those other requirements are not waived. What is waived is that cost share match requirement. So I think that's a really important thing to also highlight.
Thank you all. I'm scrolling through and seeing that there are a lot of questions we've already answered. So continuing to go through, if you see any, feel free to just jump in. Jen and Cliff, you may have answered this already. Is there a maximum eligible request tied to organizational budget size?
There's only one request, which is $50,000. There's no more, no less. It's just a $50,000 grant.
Thanks for clarifying. And
again, just to re-clarify one thing is that there's also no match required for that.
And it could be, a large organization might decide to apply for that $50,000 to be expended in the next 3 months. And a small organization, might be requesting that support to extend over a 2-year project period. So even though the amount for a very small organization could feel like a lot, or maybe questions of would they be able to apply and manage that amount, just sort of think about that vis-a-vis, over the time frame of up to 2 years, if that helps you get there.
great. I saw a question about just again in terms of what kind of staff this can go to supporting. Will funds from this be able to pay 1099 contract employees?
Yes, we can support contractual artists. as part of the budget, absolutely.
Awesome.
And again, I think that the key is just to be really creative there. If, you know, we're trying to retain jobs, not sort of create new work. However, if your organization is having to pivot in order to stay in operation, you know, those contractual needs might look a little different to sort of continue the life of the organization than it did 2 months ago. So, you know, just be creative in how you sort of present those contractual artists that might appear in your budget as being really mission critical for the delivery of your organization's activities, not in creating, you know, a whole new, brand new, you know, shiny idea that you would typically apply for funding through some of our other grant categories.
Right. And what we're understanding is that folks are asking lots of specific questions about all kinds of staff, but it's all staff who you deem important. Folks are also asking questions about, is there an end date? They know the start date for the grant for the funding is in July. Is there an end date? Do they have to pay out or spend the, you know, the entire $50,000 by a certain date?
By up to 2 years. So by June 30th, 2022.
Great. I don't have the specific question up at the moment, but there are, I saw a variety of questions that were about local and state funds and if they will be subject to the same rules.
So state arts agencies are developing their own guidelines for funding, and so I think that people are just going to need to be vigilant in looking for those announcements and deadlines, reaching out to your state arts agencies and your regional arts organizations, or, you know, for those of you in DC or in the territories, the same is also true for your arts agencies. So just be looking for that, watching for that. There's not a fixed deadline that all of them are, you know, there's not going to be a single announcement across the United States where they're all rolling these out at the same time. Every state is different. So just keep your eyes open for that.
Great. Should maybe just elaborate a little bit more about how specific folks should be about how their organization's finances have been impacted by the pandemic?
Well, so the application, yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things here is that everybody who's going to be eligible to apply for these funds is going to have some experience filling out NEA applications. And one thing that you'll find is that this CARES funding application is, by a long shot, the most concise application, certainly that I've seen in the 4 years that I've been at the Arts Endowment, and then in the 7 years that I was applying to the Arts Endowment for funding. So you don't have a lot of room to move in this application. There's not a ton of space for questions and answers. And so however you approach that, right? However you approach sharing how your organization has been impacted economically by the pandemic, you are going to want to be concise as possible, because you only have a certain amount of space to say that, as well as what you're requesting funding for, who you're serving, etc. So just be, you know, put your wordsmithing to maximum use here.
And I think that you'll see sort of, if you get into the application questions themselves, and that's part 2 PDF, you know, there are very specific pointed questions to that effect. So describe the effect on your organization if this position was curtailed or eliminated. You know, you're asking to describe the significance of the work to the mission and core of your organization, and describe the effect on your organization if this activity was not to be taking place. So there are really pointed questions in the application form that I would point you to.
Thank you. Can you tell us when and how the part 2 questions will be available?
They're up there now, up on our website. You can just click on that part 2 and you'll be able to download the PDF that details all of it, including the character limits, including what we actually want you to enter into some fields. For example, project title. We don't need you to come up with a project title, enter CARES Act. You know, there's very specific guidance that's already up on our website, so access that now.
Great, thank you. Okay, what else do we have? Here's maybe another specific question. If you were paying an artist, for instance, in a previous NEA Artworks budget, but that program's been canceled due to COVID, is that considered double counting?
So I think it depends on, did you pay the artist up to a certain point for their work? And then do you perceive continued or new invention of what that work looks like in this CARES Act funding? So that's kind of the guidance I would give you. If you have support for that position and their work, the work of the artist is really pivoting, we have a whole series of FAQs, and you can contact our specialists who can sort of guide you if you have an open grant, how you may be able to really shift some of the project activities given the current situation. But I would say it just kind of depends on the timing and what that covers. It's kind of hard to know. That's a pretty specific question that would probably be really well answered by, as you can see on our screen here, we have a direct link to all the NEA staff that can field follow-up questions by discipline. So the discipline that you typically apply to is who you'll want to reach out to, and just get into some of the nitty-gritties about that.
Thank you for reminding us about that, Jen. Can you also confirm?
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you confirm again whether this grant conflicts with other CARES, SBA, or PPP grants or loans?
Cliff, I feel like you said it well last time.
Yeah, so sorry, I was just looking up the answer to it. So was the question about requests for SBA support versus Arts Endowment CARES support?
Yes.
So,
or other federal opportunities that organizations might be going after.
Yeah, so if people are going after multiple sources of, if organizations are going after multiple sources of CARES funding, the Arts Endowment's position is that is allowable. Not our position, the Arts Endowment rules that is allowable. But again, at the end of all of this, your organization is going to need to be reporting to all of these agencies. And so you should not be requesting support, let's say, from the Arts Endowment and from the Small Business Administration and from a state arts agency, all for the same salary line, or all for the same, whatever the budget line is that you're requesting support for, or budget lines, right? So you're just going to want to make sure that that any funding that you receive from multiple sources is going into different lines in your budget.
And I think that's really helpful, Cliff. But it's also just in our FAQs, that is our #1 question that really encapsulates what Cliff shared here. So just a reminder and a plug that we have some great FAQs on our website, And that list is growing just based on what we're continually hearing from the field. But the very first one is exactly that, and sort of any potential overlap with programs offered by the SBA, for example.
Thank you both. Go ahead, Cliff.
I've seen a couple of questions on here with a really simple answer. A couple of people have written in asking about mortgage payments for buildings or a building that is owned by the organization. And you'll see on our FAQs on our website that is, I believe it's in the FAQs. If it's not, that is considered allowable. So that will probably be good news to the people that ask that question. You know, I also see a lot of questions from people that are variations on the same theme, which is there a strategic advantage in terms of, you know, asking for like a mosaic of support across a number of different budget lines, you know, or across a number of different positions, versus kind of honing this down to one person's salary line, or honing this towards just towards facilities costs or whatever. You know, there's not a simple answer to that question. I think that your organization needs what it needs, and it needs it however it needs it. And so I would anticipate that we're going to see a lot of both scenarios. And so, you know, on the one hand, making a request for, you know, again, this is a grant narrative, and so in some ways, it might appear to be a simpler through line if it's one position, or if it's one item on your budget that you need the entire $50,000 for. But again, you know, I think that the burden, if you're asking for support for multiple lines or multiple people, is just that, again, you're going to want that narrative to be clear, and you're going to want the budget that you're submitting to match your narrative. So just be sure that those things match up well, and that, you know, trying to present too broad of a mosaic doesn't confuse the story that you're trying to tell in your application.
And Cliff, just on that note, I think just a reminder for folks who are participating, there very well may be folks on this call that are going to be tapped to be readers to assess the application. So you're really writing to your peers, not to just us as discipline directors at the NEA, but to the panel of reviewers. So that clarity in, you know, how they're going to be reviewing many applications is really critically important. So I think that's just a fine point to put on there.
And, you know, I'll just add to that you know, our readers for this particular opportunity will be people who have been panelists for us in the past, and so these are people that are also just familiar with our process, and are veteran peers and colleagues of yours in the field across disciplines.
Thank you both so much for your time. I know we're already a minute over, and we covered a lot of information, and I know that folks still have many more questions. So as a reminder, Jen has shared this slide, which you can all visit to know who to best direct your question to. Thank you all for joining, and thank you so much, Jen and Cliff, for making the time and for all your incredible work in getting this, getting all these resources to people. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you know, it's an honor to be here. I hope this was useful to everybody. And you know, we send all of our I don't know, just positivity and energy, for whatever that's worth, out everybody that's on this call. One last thing, I have seen some questions here, and we've received a number of questions about whether funding can go towards development directors. And I'm sure that there are a number of development directors on the line, and the answer is yes. So, you know, I remember from 12 years ago that oftentimes that was a position that was threatened during the recession, and so that is something that's considered eligible. Anyhow, best of luck, everybody, and we wish you well, and stay well, and be well, and yeah, we hope to see you down the road.
Well said. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.